Last night, the Republicans started the process to transfer $4.5 trillion from the middle class and those aspiring to be to the wealthiest, to Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and those who belong to Mar-a-Lago. They passed their budget bill that's part of the reconciliation process, the process to get around the 60 votes you need in the Senate in order to pass this tax cut that only the wealthiest will ultimately enjoy in this country. The good news is we have a guest today that is beyond an expert. She was the director of the Office of Management and Budget under Joe Biden, the number one person dealing with these issues. Someone who actually, before and after she was in that position, Russ Vought, the architect of Project 2025, is in that position. So this is someone who gets this, can explain this, and at the end of the program, hopefully you'll understand why the Republicans are ripping you off to give the wealthiest a tax break, and that's just wrong. So I hope you enjoy this program.
So the first part is just a short, single question that we're going to ask of people from all walks of life that work with the federal government about what they would change with federal government. I'm here with Wendell Potter. Wendell is with the Center for Health and Democracy, one of the leading groups that talks about Medicare disadvantage, I guess might be the better way of calling it. I have a question for you. If you had the power to pass one law in Congress, what would that law be?
That law would be legislation that would restrain the profit making, the profiteering of big insurance companies. Because until we can do that, we're never going to have a healthcare system that is fair in this country or affordable, because it is rigged the way it is right now for insurance companies as middlemen to extract so much money from us, and they actually create more spending and capture so much of what we spend as middlemen. We've got to have legislation if we ever want to have universal health care in this country, or just health care that's affordable and available to people at a price that they can afford. You've got to rein in these companies. You've got to address the various ways that they're ripping taxpayers off. And it's huge. We spend about $5 trillion on healthcare in this country, and increasingly that money flows through these companies and is captured and shared with large institutional investors. So that's what it would save an enormous amount of money. You know, we hear about the new administration wanting to save billions of dollars or trillions of dollars. This is a good place to find it.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
For members of Congress holding town halls last week, they got an earful. The chaotic start to the Trump presidency has been anything but boring, with an unelected person like Elon Musk acting as the co-president. But what has captured most of Washington's attention recently has been an infrequently used process called reconciliation. So what exactly is reconciliation? Well, by the end of the episode, you'll know more about reconciliation than most members of Congress do. But simply put, it's the process that gets around a 60-vote filibuster rule in the Senate that in this case will start the process of transferring the necessary money to fund the Trump tax cut for the wealthiest by stealing at least $1.5 trillion from the middle class and those aspiring to be. But it's complicated. You don't vote directly for specific cuts, but you tell a specific committee that it has to cut programs or find the cuts. And then we'll have a second round of votes on those specific cuts. But the reconciliation bill, in this case, also will raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. So Donald Trump can give himself and Elon Musk a tax cut. And of course, this is all at our expense. No one knows more about reconciliation in this obscure process than the 43rd director of the Office of Management and Budget, Shalanda Young. Shalanda was born and raised in Louisiana. She moved to Washington, D.C. around 2001. She became a presidential management fellow, a position I understand Trump has now ended. And she worked with the National Institutes of Health. For 14 years, she was a staffer at the U.S. House Committee on Appropriations, working with Dave Obey from Wisconsin, someone who obviously I have enormous respect for. And in February of 2017, she was named the staff director for the committee, a position she held until her nomination for deputy director of OMB in 2021. She became the OMB director. And, as the staff director on the committee, she did things like create the proposals related to the 2018 and 2019 shutdown. And she also dealt with the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As the OMB director for Joe Biden, she also helped lead the Democratic side in negotiations over the 2023 debt ceiling crisis. So I am more proud because I call Shalanda a friend, because she is, and she's an amazing and extraordinary person in every way. Welcome, Shalanda.
Thank you so much, Mark. Who knew the girl from Louisiana would end up with so many friends from Wisconsin?
I know. Well, and Dave Obey was really foundational with you, right? When you got to appropriations?
He was foundational in my life. I'm one of those people. My grandmother helped raise me, so there's something about sitting at the feet of people who have a lived experience. So he let this young staffer come hang around, listen to his stories from his special election in 1969, tell me how the Budget Committee, the Budget Control Act, the Empowerment and Control Act, how that law came to be. And you remember, he came from the Nixon era. He got there a little before the Watergate babies, but they knew a little something about corruption, which is how that law to protect Congress's will came about. So how timely it is to remember Mr. Obey, who stood up against some of the stuff we're seeing today.
Well, I'm glad he could spot extraordinary talent in you, and now we've all benefited from you, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you're all going to do next. But for people listening, what is the OMB? I think that would be a really good place to start.
And then you can tell my mother what it is, because I'm still trying to let my family know what I do. And they just know they don't see me very much, or didn't. I get to take a break now. But the Office of Management and Budget, I tell people when I meet them, I'm the president's budget director. That's the simplest way to think about it. A president tells the American people when they run, these are my values. This is how I'm going to help improve your life. And I had the lucky job of putting together a budget. It's not a numbers document, it's a values document. Mm-hmm. So these promises presidents make to people, you find them in his or her budget. And everything points back to how you think about bringing down costs. That's why you saw Joe Biden and Democrats push for more child care assistance, more healthcare premium assistance. And that document, people are like, you're good at math. I'm like, no, I'm good at people. I hope I still have a finger on the pulse of what Americans care about. And that getting to put that kind of document together really was the pinnacle of my career, because it exemplified how we believe we could help everyday Americans. And then on top of doing the budget for the president, we got to do the management agenda. It sounds boring, but now it turns out it is not. It is how we staff up government agencies, how we think about reducing waste, fraud, and abuse without taking a hatchet to the government, how we can make things run better. Again, you can do that without being disruptive. And we've seen all of that is just being lost in the way things are being done now. And also controlling the regulatory agenda. Major regulations had to come through the Office of Management and Budget. So really like that center piece that makes the bureaucracy run. Small agency who talks agency, but also talks White House. And it takes what a president promised to the American people and knows how to use government tools to make the bureaucracy turn for the president.
And interestingly, you're bookended by Russell Vought, who is one of the architects of Project 2025 and maybe part of what we're all seeing now. I just find that interesting that, at least you were the meat of the sandwich, maybe, to put it.
I don't know if I like that, Mark.
The substance. How's that? The substance.
Okay.
Because I'm with you. The reason I always wanted to be on appropriations back in the legislature, I was co-chair of our Joint Committee on Finance, is that's where you put your values, right? Where we put our tax dollars. You're completely right. It's a document of values. It's not just about scalping a bunch of money out. You don't know where it comes from. So let's start the reconciliation thing, because I think it is really, really confusing. And I'm a journalism school major. We're told to bring everything down to eighth grade level so that people can, the most people can understand it. So if you were explaining this to a middle school, person, what is a reconciliation bill at that 30,000 foot level?
It is simply a tool Congress has made up for itself to pass a budget with a simple majority. If anyone has watched Congress, they know the Senate takes 60 votes to pass anything, and that makes it nearly impossible to pass laws. So forget the fancy term. Literally, members before I was born, especially in the Senate, came up with a way to pass budget-related items with a 51 vote total instead of 60.
And I know one session it was used like a ton of times, right? I mean,
that's right. I mean, if Congress, we're in a different era and it was easy to get 70 senators on a vote, the House has always been majority. But this is really, to uncomplicated it, it's passing a budget the easiest way they know how. And senators, generation ago came up with this reconciliation tool. And they found a way to do it. They made it up. And so I try not to stick on this very complicated tool. It was made by people because they couldn't get 60 votes for something. And they had enough people who probably wanted to pass something, and they knew they had 51 votes. They didn't have 60. And they sat around and looked at the Senate rules, and they're like, what can we come up with to do this? And they go, well, budgets are important, so let's do this expedited process. Let's call it reconciliation. But at the end of the day, it's the same values statement, except it's even more than a budget, because it could possibly become law. So all the things we're going to talk about today, let's take this very archaic reconciliation term out. It's a budget.
Gotcha.
And it can become law. And the things in it we need to talk about as if they are real things. Forget the stages they're in. These votes will result in X, Y, and Z. That's just the reality. It's just we made it complicated, probably to hide some of the bad things that people want to do.
And that's a perfect jumping point on this, because I think one of the things we're finding is that the Republicans are having somewhat of a hard time lining up all their members, because some of the things that are in this, while they're not specific as far as like saying you're going to cut X dollars from Medicaid, you really are by targeting a certain amount that has to be cut. In fact, this bill requires, I think it's a floor of $1.5 trillion in cuts. And I think, is that over 10 years? Is that correct?
That is over 10 years. All these budget bills are 10-year periods.
Yeah. And why is it 10 years? Just explain that, because I think some of this is stuff that might be helpful.
Well, one, there's an idea when presidents' budgets were being put together, when budget laws were being passed, that we need to take a longer look. This isn't just about our economic picture today. How long can we forecast out? And you see Wall Street does this, and it is an acknowledgement that looking at 1 year for a majority of the budget just did not give the American people a full picture of what end goal we were trying to achieve with our economy. So it made sense, if you're going to do a Medicaid or a SNAP policy, so food aid, to give people some certainty over a longer period of time. Obviously, Mark, we worked on the part of the budget that was 1 year, but that's about 28% of the budget these days. These larger programs, the idea is, and I believe it's true, that states, individuals who rely on these programs need some certainty beyond 1 or 2 years.
Gotcha. So I'm here again with Shalanda Young, the last director of the OMB in the Biden administration. So let's talk a little bit about this part, because I find it's confusing for people when I talk to them. I was just obviously home last week, as we're all members of the House, except for maybe Derek Van Orden. I think he was on vacation in Israel, but most members were back in their district. A lot of people had town halls, got an earful. The the idea that you're not explicitly saying you're cutting X, Y, or Z, but you're sort of implicitly doing that. Can you just talk a bit about what that actually means? And we'll get into
Yes.
specifics with dollars later.
So math is math. If you ask the committee, this one, Energy and Commerce, to cut almost $900 billion, anyone who pays attention to what that committee controls knows they have to cut Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
This is the first step. So that committee, they won't tell you how they're going to cut Medicaid yet. But if they go forward with this process, the only way the math works is to cut Medicaid. They can cut it by capping Medicaid. That means your states, Wisconsin for you, and others, costs get shifted to them. I don't know about you, but every state will then have some tough decisions and will have to cut services themselves. They can end expanded Medicaid, something Democrats worked very hard to do. And now we have 100 million souls covered under Medicaid. That will no longer be the case. They can impose work requirements. But I want to pause there. A lot of times they say, oh, we just do these common sense work requirements. You can't come near $900 billion in cuts with just work requirements. Do not be fooled by that. There aren't enough reforms, if you even call them reforms, to do this. You have to cut benefits to get to those targets. You have to. Yeah. Other ways you can do it is to end health protections. None of these are things we want if we're in the business of expanding healthcare. And so the math just is not math. And I hope people understand, like, this will become more real as the process goes along. So yeah, we might see now only targets, but those targets mean the next bill you vote on, you will see the impact on Medicaid. That's why we have to talk about this and try to stop this now, because there's no other way to go. If you want that committee to cut $900 billion, they're cutting Medicaid.
So this cut specifically is part of that floor of $1.5 trillion. I think it was a minimum of $880 billion. They're asking the Energy and Commerce Committee. And what you've just said, is the part that Democrats are saying is, look, the only way you can do that is to go after Medicaid. And they're all saying, well, we're not cutting Medicaid. Even Donald Trump has said, we're not touching Medicaid. Well, either it's an outright lie to say that, or they're going to manipulate this. And as you said, people often have said work requirements, but that doesn't get you there. In Wisconsin, a third of all kids get their health care from Medicaid. I think it's about 39% nationwide. It's even higher. In Wisconsin, 45% of people living on their own with disabilities are on Medicaid. 55% of seniors in nursing homes are on Medicaid. And that's just a lot of money. But, they put out this false narrative that we're going to do it through work requirements. But no, this is either actual cuts to services to people, or I guess you could also say, if you're going to maintain those services at the state level, it's going to be a tax increase. So yet another way the middle class and those aspiring to be the middle class wind up paying for these tax cuts.
You're absolutely right. You just said the thing that I want to make sure we don't lose. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Why are we doing this? Why are we cutting, not we, but why do we see this agenda to cut Medicaid, to cut food benefits? It's all for tax cuts. And it's all for tax cuts that are skewed to the wealthy. In the 2017 tax cuts that Republicans passed through reconciliation with just their votes, for example, they took the corporate tax rate to 21%. Mm-hmm. Less than, like, some people who go off to their jobs every morning pay as a percentage.
Yeah.
Now you hear people, oh, that's too much. These job creators, they shouldn't pay more than 15%. So we're literally cutting Medicaid in exchange to give tax cuts to those who are doing just fine in this country. I'm a capitalist. I believe in capitalism, but this is bordering on cruel. And we cannot lose this aspect. The cuts are bad enough, but the reason for the cuts are just unconscionable.
Yeah, and we're going to come to a little bit about the tax cuts in a little bit, because again, you are an expert at everything financial here, Shalanda. I love it that you're here today. But you're right. That is the big issue. I had a panel with people who are on Medicaid, people who were living in their houses or their homes, but with disabilities, people with kids who are getting support from Medicaid, and others. And you actually had people kind of saying, well, I know they're trying to get waste, fraud, and abuse. No, that's a fraud. That is the fraud. This is about stealing money from programs that help average people across the country so that Elon Musk and Donald Trump and those who can afford to belong to Mar-a-Lago get a big tax cut. And if the numbers are right, I'm not sure if you know this, Shalanda, but I thought I heard if we extend the Trump tax cuts at the end of this next period, the 10 years, I think 83% of the money essentially go to the top 1% or something like that.
Top
Do you know that?
1%. Most of the tax cuts, the broader tax cuts go to top 5%. So,
Yeah.
certainly those over 400,000, but mostly skewed, to those in the top 1 or 2%. But the vast majority are for people who make far beyond what the average American makes in income.
Yeah. Well, and one of the other areas they're looking at cutting that is especially egregious, in my opinion, it's about a $230 billion cut for agricultural committee. But what their big portion of their budget is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is, I think, the number one program that keeps kids out of poverty. I think it's about $6.16 a day of food assistance. And yet, if you're not cutting that, you're going to have to cut rural broadband or money for dairy farmers or for, so many other areas. So, can you talk about what we're likely to see with those targeted cuts towards the Department of Agriculture?
I mean, you've said it. About 40 million people get assistance in SNAP, and I got to be a part of something I'm incredibly proud of, but it's also sobering. Only during the Biden administration in 2021 did we raise SNAP benefits per person from $4.80 to $6.20. We're only at $6.20. And, we were criticized that was too much. So we are now talking about the only way for that committee to meet these targets that the budget says is to go in and cut food assistance. Remember, there are already work requirements if you want to get SNAP for certain individuals.
Yeah.
So we're left with cutting assistance to hit these numbers. And you just heard how much people are getting. This isn't some program where people are just sitting around doing nothing. Most people can't feed their families on $6.20 a day per person. So this will absolutely, what we aren't doing is looking at the total cost. If kids don't have access to food, we're going to pay for it in a different way. We're going to pay for it in our medical system. We're going to pay for it in our schools because kids can't focus and won't attend. This stuff is very short-sighted.
Yeah. My freshman term, this issue came up from, I think, the House majority at the time under John Boehner. And so a number of us either went one day or 1 week, and I foolishly went 1 week living on SNAP. So I think I had $30-some to do this on. And, a bag of oranges was 15% of my budget. And I had a lot of ramen noodles and peanut butter. And I was kind of grumpy that week, I was told by the office. But, this isn't something anyone's living large on. And it is the number one program I've always been told to keep kids out of poverty, because it's just about food. It's not, anything but that.
Yeah, think about our school meals. Schools in every state serving children, low income, they now have, administrative costs covered, trying to eliminate the stigma of children who have to use SNAP. I went to school with kids who use SNAP. If you've ever been around kids who are in line, it is stigmatizing to them. And sometimes they would go without, not to have to admit they had free or reduced lunches because their families also qualify for SNAP. But imagine if we, target this. It covers now 24,000 schools serving 12 million children. It's real damage, all to provide tax cuts.
Yeah.
And this one really guts me, because this is people barely on the edge
Mm.
of paying bills, staying in a home, staying in the ability to stay in an apartment. These kind of changes push families over the edge,
Yeah.
and we're really playing with fire here.
Well, one of the other really big cuts in this reconciliation of the bill, or just budget bill, I should call you, right? Not just giving it the formalized, confusing term, is the $330 billion cut for education. And, as I understand it, I mean, that's either got to come from Pell Grants
Well,
or Title I funding or IDA funding for special ed. And at the end of the day, in many of these cases, especially at K to 12, that's going to result in either fewer teachers and bigger classroom sizes, or a push onto the local property taxpayers. So then the middle class and those aspiring to be there not only get the impact of these cuts, but then they're just going to pay it somewhere else so that the wealthiest get this cut. Can you talk a bit about that education cut, where that could come from, and what that impact means?
I mean, you listed the programs, the ones that are large enough to even help meet those targets are Pell Grants, Title I, IDA. Though you will often hear this refrain, well, why is the federal government even in education business? That all comes from locals. Well, that's great if you're from a locality with a high tax base. If you come from a rich area, schools are probably okay. What Title I and the disabilities program does is try to make sure there's a minimum standard of education, no matter how much your parents make, no matter how poor or rich your school district is, there should be a minimum level of education and access for kids with disabilities into our public school systems. Just trying. And by the way, we don't have enough money to do that.
Yeah.
But trying to make sure there's some fairness and an equal footing so that kids get to start off life with a basic education. And if you have a disability, those parents have access to tools to make sure their kids can continue to access public education. And those things used to have bipartisan support. We talked about Dave Obey got here. This was something Democrats and Republicans could agree on. More Pell Grants, more Title I, more IDEA. So it just boggles the mind how we've gotten here.
Yeah, and Pell Grants, I grew up in a lower middle class family. I benefited from. I had Pell Grants in order to go to college, and I never took a spring break because I had to work also while in college, in addition to getting that and loans. But it should be
work study over here.
Yeah, I mean, if you're smart enough and capable enough, you should hopefully be able to get an education, and it shouldn't matter whether or not you're also rich enough. That shouldn't be the factor. And Pell is something that I think pretty universally, I agree. It used to be there wasn't any controversy over it, but you're going to have to go after one of those, or probably all three of those areas, to meet $330 billion in cuts.
You just have to.
Yeah.
And Pell Grants, most people, we again worked in a bipartisan way. Every year we pat ourselves on the back to increase the maximum Pell amount, because we know as the cost for education has gone up, Pell has not kept up with that. So we have more work to do to expand Pell.
Yeah.
And we've been on a good footing to do that. This could undo all of that.
Yeah, I had a bill to double Pell over 5 years, and Biden administration was amazing at getting that done and on target. And, this is going to take us backwards. There's no question. Any other cuts that I'm not highlighting? Those are, I think, three biggest pools of money, but anything else you think is important to mention?
Those are the big ones. Medicaid, certainly, food assistance, the education cuts. Those are the ones that I focused on, and I think are most important to remind people of what this means, because you're right. This is a process that's in steps. So you see these vague targets, but the math, there's a reason experts are very clear-eyed, and that's a reason certain Republicans are nervous about these. There's no way to hit these targets without hitting these programs. Let me double. I said there was not one more. The other one I'm worried about is the Affordable Care Act.
Oh yes, yeah.
Even if they don't cut the Affordable Care Act, I am concerned that the Biden administration and Democrats work to increase the premium subsidies. So to help middle-class families afford healthcare plans, I'm very worried that those won't be extended. And that will effectively be a cut. If you're Republicans and you go, well, we don't extend these tax cuts, that'll be an increase for families. That's the same argument then for continuing the Affordable Care Act premiums.
Right.
To have healthcare go up in a time, frankly, I'm terribly worried about the economy writ large when we see some of these inflation reports. That's a cut to middle-class families. And I'm incredibly worried they will not do anything to expand the assistance we provided to those who get their health insurance through the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, I just talked to a member from Oregon over the noon hour, and they said because of the Affordable Care Act, their uninsured rate in their district went from 20% to a little over 3%.
Yeah.
And if you change this, more people then lose their health care. So Elon Musk and Donald Trump can get a tax cut.
Yeah, without this premium assistance, people will drop off of these plans.
Yeah.
It's just that simple.
Is there anything, and I don't know this, so I'd appreciate your knowledge. Is there anything in this proposal that's like funny money with tariffs or anything else? Is there
not yet?
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet. But as people get nervous about Medicaid cuts, which I hope they do, what people should watch out for is if the gimmicks. So cuts through press releases. So they'll go, hey, I'm not cutting anything here for the tax cuts, but look at everything that the Doge is doing. You should count all that stuff. And we're really like, it may not be in this bill, but don't worry, the president's tariff policy will bring in a bunch of money and Doge will cut a bunch of money. Well, let me tell you, that's funny money.
Yeah.
If it's not in this bill, it's funny money and it adds to the debt and deficit. So all the lectures we sat through and endured for 4 years about the debt and deficit, if they go this route where they spend a bunch of money for tax cuts, $5 trillion, and have very few cuts, but because they're politically difficult and they use a press release to point to stuff here, there, but not actually in the bill, guess what? That gets added to the debt and deficit.
Yeah, that's my prediction too. I just didn't know if there was anything explicit, because I think a lot of the tariff stuff is funny money that they're going to put out there. And I think, some obviously Doge, I mean, what a mess. I mean, Doge, could it be any more of a ridiculous, Elon Musk and a bunch of, 20-year-olds, including people with nicknames like Big Balls, going around with the spigots of every federal agency. It's frightening.
I think my heart hurts too much to really, they basically took over a part of my old agency, the U.S. Digital Service. That agency just did fantastic work that we'd get people mid-career in private sector and tech and bring them in for public service for 2 or 4 years. And they go off. We just talked about the Affordable Care Act. Guess what? They help fix healthcare.gov. A couple of senior political officials got a lot of credit, but it was those people who helped go fix that for the American people. And guess what? Many of them resigned today because they said they did not sign up to cut the legs out from under the American people. They came to help. So they took over something that was meant to do a lot of help in government programs, make them work better for the American people. And we lost a lot of good people who did a lot of good work over the years because they just don't want to be a part of this. And people should look at how they're funding themselves. Someone on my team did some great analysis. I think they transferred over $6 million to themselves to do all of this work. And I question whether that action is even legal. So we have funny money everywhere. We They don't have the cuts they claim they have. And, while they're trying to save everyone else, they're taking money from other government programs to fund themselves. And I hope we do some work there to look into that.
Well, and they're not held to the same standards. Like, you couldn't have a federal contract, right? In the position you were in as a member of Congress, I can't have a federal contract. The position I'm in, a federal employee can't, and anywhere they have control over it. And here Elon Musk has had $20 billion, $3 billion right now in federal contracts, and now still getting them literally every week since he's been in office. He's getting more contracts.
Well, I found it very interesting. We don't talk a lot about NASA cuts now, do we?
No. Yes, exactly. And if an agency was investigating him, they were the first place they went. USAID was one of them that was looking at the Starlink contract. All right, we're going to do a separate episode someday on Doge. But so, would this be right now? Is it on target to be the largest transfer of money from the middle class to the wealthiest for tax cuts in our history? Does it look like that's going to happen?
Look, the size of the tax cuts, nearly $5 trillion. And if one pays for it in the way these targets suggest, one can only conclude that your statement is factual. Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act, Children's Health Insurance Program, SNAP. These are people who go to work every day, get a paycheck, and they pay their taxes, and they do the best for their families. They would then be contributing to tax cuts they benefit from almost not at all.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about fairness in our tax system, who we believe in the most, who built this country, who deserves a break. This is the opposite of that. I believe the people who use these programs are hardworking Americans who just need a little help from their government to stay on the right side of keeping their families and their homes and food on the table. And if they just get a little help, if they get lucky enough to get a Head Start slot and mom can go to work, that family makes it and improves in the next 3 to 5 years. If we cut the rug from under them, who are we for? And I guess we're for people who get to take advantage of these big tax cuts.
Yeah. So in wrapping this episode down, I mean, just a little bit so people can understand what we're talking about when we say these are tax cuts for Elon Musk and Donald Trump and others who can afford to join places like Mar-a-Lago. This is not for the average person who's listening to this. I mean, so it's a lower rate for the wealthiest. It's a lower corporate rates already, I believe, been locked in. But what are some of the other provisions that you know of offhand? I know that you're more on the approach side as opposed to maybe the spending side, but are there other things we should be watching for that are especially egregious?
Well, you're right. Corporate tax. I find this, just interesting. In 2017, they made the corporate tax breaks permanent.
Yeah.
So you never have to worry about them again, corporations.
Yeah.
They made individuals temporary. So now they get to go say, well, we don't do this. But guess what? I don't trust that they don't go back and lower corporate tax rates again.
Right.
I mean, many of them have talked about that. So they may be permanent, but that does not mean they can't be lowered again.
Yeah.
I worry about more tax breaks from those who transfer wealth without ever having that income realized. Look, most people go to work, they get a paycheck, they get taxed. Many middle-class Americans are over 20% taxed. Our billionaire and 100 millionaires friends, there was one analysis, they might pay 8% of their income, if you can call it that, because most of them don't take income. They've learned ways to keep transferring it after they pass away. And we're just going to build on that ability for people who are incredibly blessed. If our country wants to continue in this mode of being the leaders of free world and carry on this incredible legacy of the gifts we were endowed with, we cannot become a society where there are some people who have everything and most people who have almost nothing. Yes. And this tax bill just doubles down on that, which should make us all concerned.
In even some of the stuff they don't outline in this bill that I'm concerned about is, for example, exempting tips from income taxes. I think you could make a very good case for people who are on especially sub minimum wage, right, to be able to benefit from something. But the bill that Ted Cruz introduced last session to do just that set it up so that a hedge fund manager could get actually their reimbursement in what essentially would be a tip and then not pay any taxes. And that's the problem, is the devil's in the details, but those guys are devils sometimes.
You said it much clearer than I could.
Well, Shalanda, if people want to follow you and anything you do in the future, I'm following you because I know you were one of the best and the brightest I've worked with since I've been in the federal government. And, again, really honored to have you as a friend. How can people follow you or the work you're doing? Anything you want to put out there for people?
Not yet, Mark. One,
Okay.
I'm still trying to recover from 23 years. And, this really is shock and awe.
Yeah.
And, I've thought a lot about the response for those of us who see this, worked on this stuff, but just care about people. And people are like, what can I do to be helpful? One, don't let it demoralize you, because those, some people who are doing some of this harm want that to happen. They want people to fall out of the system and not participate. So I'm doing my best to be optimistic. I'll write about some of the stuff I'm teaching at NYU and University of Chicago, and trying to sit around young people who still are idealistic, because there's got to be a way to come back to reality. There's got to be a time where people, Republicans or Democrats, say something about this isn't right. Why are we going after families who are surviving on $6.20 a day for SNAP in order to, help the top 5% of households and big corporations? There's something that's not sustainable for our country. And so I'm gonna try and be hopeful, because otherwise they win, and I just refuse to let that happen. And we're gonna. I always try to reach out to people I know are bothered by this, but who aren't saying anything. And eventually, like-minded Republicans and those who know their people are getting hurt by this have to say something and stand up. And I'm gonna work like hell to create some space, hopefully, for them to do that, because it can't be one party cares about democracy and the other one does not. Right. It doesn't work that way.
Well, Shalanda, thank you for your 23 years of service, and the students who are learning from you at University of Chicago and NYU are very lucky to have you as an instructor. And I know I learned a lot from you when you were our staff director at appropriations, being a new member on there. And again, I think I'm one of your biggest fans. So thank you so much for being with us today. And thanks for sharing a little more information so people know what's really up with this.
Yeah, forget the reconciliation word. It's just meant to confuse.
Budget bill. I'm going to start saying budget bill. I learned. Thank you, Shalanda. I appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks for listening to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some.